what I wanted to talk to you about. The USS Langley became a part of the history of the US Navy. It was their first aircraft carrier, and it had an association with Fremantle and an association with Maylands Aerodrome. And that's the aspect of things I'd like to talk to you about. But we'd better go right back to the beginning. So, in 1912, a ship called the Jupiter was launched in the US. It was the first electrically driven ship. It had a steam turbine, and the steam turbine ran an electricity system which drove the propellers. The ship Jupiter was designed as a collier to supply coal to the US fleet. As a collier, it had a whole superstructure on board which was there to aid the loading and unloading of the coal. It went through World War I on the American seaboard. In 1919 it was decommissioned. The US Navy had seen that the British had developed aircraft carriers. They'd started with platforms on top of gun turrets, then into other small decks to catapult aircraft from. And finally, then they removed the superstructure of the ship and put a full-length deck on it. They then went ahead and by 1918 were building their first, from the keel up, aircraft. The Americans decided that they should move into the aircraft carrier business. And after lots of discussion, they decided to start with the conversion of one of their existing ships. And they chose the Jupiter to remove the superstructure. And so all of that stuff that you can see on the image there was removed, and it became that. 253 feet of deck, 65 feet wide. They then had to learn how to use what they'd constructed. And this is a photograph of the first landing of an aircraft on the USS Langley. They called it the Langley after Samuel Pierpont Langley, who made his name with the invention of the aircraft and was in competition with the Wright brothers, so they say. Anyway, they discovered very quickly that undercarriages were being stressed and damaged and broken. Fuselages weren't strong enough to accept the arrestor system, and the arrestor system which they developed for the deck was substandard. They had to modify that. They started off with arrestor wires going through pulleys to below deck where they had weights. And sometimes they got the weights wrong. The aircraft would land and go sprung. I don't know whether this will show, but if you look at that gentleman there, that's probably Commander Whiting. And he stood up and watched every landing. Got to the stage where they they took movies of every landing to analyse what went wrong. And Commander Whiting used to stand there and observe the landings, and his body language was quite severe. He used to use his hands and his arms and body, and the pilots in the end started to look at him as much as they did the deck of the aircraft carrier. He unwittingly became the first deck signalling officer, and he was replaced by a man in a yellow jacket with a couple of bats. And on it went. So the Langley, launched in 1922, put into action as their first aircraft carrier. Oh, back in that one, you might be able to see that those chaps standing there were standing in nets, and both sides of the flight deck had nets attached, so that if the aircraft went over the side, they'd be caught up in the rope. This photograph of the takeoff in 1924, and the Langley, as far as I know, was the only US aircraft carrier up until 1927. In 1927, the US Navy launched the Saratoga and the Lexington, which were designed from the keel up as aircraft carriers. And so the Langley sort of fell by the wayside a bit. It was converted to a seaplane tender and transport ship. And there you can see that some of the deck has been removed. Seaplanes could be swung on deck and then below deck, and service could be carried out on them. That's just another shot to show you the aspect of how it could be used. And then came Pearl Harbor. The Americans had to move very quickly in the Pacific. The Japanese were well organised. The Americans thought they were, but they weren't as well organised as they thought. The Langley, like the Lexington and Saratoga, were put to sea in the Pacific Ocean. And the Langley, as a transport ship, ended up coming as far as Darwin by early 1942. So in the first weeks of February, or January 1942, the Langley was actually in Darwin. The Japanese were advancing at a great rate. In fact, they were moving forward at 1,000 miles a month. In the 3 months from Pearl Harbor, they got down as far as Sumatra. They had hoped that what they called the Malay Barrier would arrest their move, but this wasn't the case. The Japanese kept moving, and plans had to be changed very, very quickly. Prior to January, February 1942, there were all sorts of moves afoot to send troops and equipment to the Netherlands East Indies. But it was changing day after day. The Americans were flying P-40s. They called, the model they used was a Warhawk. We would probably call it a Kittyhawk. If I mix the two up, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But they lost 60% of their aircraft in the transfer, flying them from Brisbane to the Netherlands East Indies. So they decided to put in place another plan. And that was to ship the aircraft on the Langley. And so on the 11th of February, 36 P-40s were dispatched from Brisbane, and it took them 6 days to get across the country to Maylands Aerodrome. On the same day, the 11th of February, the Langley left Darwin for Fremantle. Just prior to that, probably a day or two earlier, a convoy of ships listed there left Melbourne to come to Fremantle to join up with the Langley and others to go to the aid of the Dutch East Indies. But things happened very, very quickly, and the plans had to be changed. On the 15th of February, on the 15th of February, Singapore fell, and the British started their withdrawal to India. On the 19th of February, with the Langley just outside of Fremantle, Darwin was bombed. Australia started to battle to protect its own shores. The Dutch were in serious trouble in Java, and they were calling for more help. Really, they were beyond hope. What happened from there was service was done on the aircraft at Maylands Aerodrome. John Harris that's here today, his father worked on the Kittyhawks. He's not with us today. I'd love to have talked to him about the work that he did on the Kittyhawks. Brian Floyd, who's not here today, also remembers seeing the Kittyhawks there, and others. Anyone remember seeing them at Maylands Aerodrome? Reg?
Yeah.
We'll have a talk. We've already had a brief talk about it. Okay, so that's evidently a photograph at Maylands of one of them being serviced. That's more of what they look like. And so on the night of February the 21st, 22nd, the aircraft were moved from Maylands to Fremantle. The tail wheel of the aircraft were tied onto a truck, onto the flatbed of a truck. And the trucks were driven by the actual pilots of the aeroplane. On the tailgate of the truck were two personnel who assisted in the transport of the aircraft by waving their arms and giving a bit of guidance. The route that the aircraft took is a bit of a mystery because it happened in the middle of the night. And in those days, everyone went to bed at midnight and got up at 6, 7 in the morning. But if that's the map with Maylands in dark green there, then the route taken was obviously out of Maylands via Peninsula Road to Guildford Road. They went down Guildford Road to the Mount Lawley subway, and according to Frank Cohoon, they used Dual Parade, which is now East, or Dual Street, which is now East Parade, and they ended up in East Perth. I've heard reports of them passing Wellington Square. How they got from Wellington Square onto Mounts Bay Road, I don't know. Anyone here got any clues? If you know anyone who knows anything, would you put the feelers out and see if you can find out what went on? Some people have suggested they went down St George's Terrace, but I can remember that outside the Treasury building in the terrace was an underground toilet for men. It had a fence around it, over waist high, and lights on it. I don't think aircraft could be towed past that. I'm suspecting they went down Wellington Street. I've heard that they went down William Street, and that's the red line that I've got on the map there. Whether they went that way or not, I don't know. I've heard all sorts of rumours about this, and I just can't track it down. I was first asked or told about this over 20 years ago, and I still haven't been able to get to the bottom of it in 20 years. So, they ended up in Fremantle, and I'm assuming they went to the North Wharf because of the ease of access. And they were loaded onto 36 aircraft left Brisbane, 32 got to Fremantle, 33 got to Maylands, but one pranged on land. So they were loaded on the night, in the morning of the 22nd of February, and the Langley departed pretty well straight away. As the Langley was leaving, the convoy arrived from the eastern states, and they said, sorry, we're not going your way, we're going to India. So the Langley virtually departed on its own. There were other ships in the area, but none of them escorted the Langley as far as Java. The convoy took off in another direction. So the Langley, on its own, with its crew, was rendezvoused with the Whipple and the Edsall, just off about 250 miles off Java. On board the Langley were its own crew, 250 extra personnel which were being taken up to Java, 50 officers, 32 aircraft, and I'm guessing 36 pilots and 36 ground crew. Could have well been more. That's somewhere near the complement that was on the Langley. Before dawn, on the 27th of February, while the Langley was 150 miles from its destination, it rendezvoused with the two destroyers, the Whipple and the Edsall. And by mid-morning, the Japanese reconnaissance aircraft in sight of the three ships. Within an hour, the Japanese aircraft were airborne, and the fate of the Langley was sealed. It wasn't very manoeuvrable. It couldn't get out of the way of bombs. The other two ships were very manoeuvrable, and they could actually see the attack coming and manoeuvre. So the Langley was hit about 4 or 5 times with substantial loss of life. This was a photograph from the Whipple of the Langley in its final hours. It was a hard ship to sink. It listed about 20 degrees to port, and so the Whipple, the water flooded into the engine compartment and short-circuited all the electrical system, and of course the engines went out. As soon as the captain realised he'd lost all power, he issued the order to abandon ship. So those that were still alive left the ship and were taken on board by the Edsall there and the Whipple, where the boat was taken from. The Whipple put a couple of shots into this side of the ship, and all they did was flood that side and get it back on an even keel again. So it then shot a torpedo into it, and it still was very reluctant to sink. And then both the Edsall and the Whipple decided they should depart the scene as quickly as possible to get out of the dangerous way. So they took off with a couple of hundred extra people on board. And they decided to rendezvous with another ship, the Pecos. The Pecos had just left the port to make way for the Langley to berth at the same spot. It had its own crew, the Pecos had its own crew, and about 250 other people who were vacating the island to get out of the place. They rendezvoused with the Edsel and the Whipple at Christmas Island, just off the superphosphate jetty, Flying Fish Cove, which you read about in the paper these days. Because other, and the Pecos took on another 700 people. Then the Japanese got onto that, and they sank the Pecos. And so what started off as a helping hand to the Dutch in the Netherlands, East Indies, ended up in the loss not only of 32 aircraft, but somewhere near 700. Probably one of the biggest stuff-ups of World War II to that time. So this is it in summary. The Whipple and the Edsel picked up the survivors from the Langley. The Pecos had another 250 personnel on board. They came together at Christmas Island. Pecos had an extra 700 heads on board. It was sunk, and hundreds of lives were lost. The Edsel was lost the next day, and pretty well its entire crew went down. A lot ended up in the ocean, and half a dozen or so were picked up by a Japanese submarine. That wasn't to their advantage at all. Eventually, the whole episode came to an end when about 270 survivors were delivered to Fremantle a few days after the Pecos went down. So that's the story of the Langley and the story of Maylands and Fremantle associated with it. It's quite a story. So if anyone has any questions, I'll only be too happy to answer them later on. And if you know anyone that knows anything about the route through Perth or the work done on the aircraft at Maylands, I'd love to know. So I'm always open to information.
Brian, where did they store the aircraft on the Langley? Did they have a system of taking them down on deck?
I believe they could take them down. There was the flight deck, then there was the cutaway section where they could lower them, and then I believe there was under that area there was storage as well. Not for a lot, but for service. They could get an aircraft down there and service it out of the elements.
No, but the original one, when the whole truck was a deck, did they have a mechanism?
Oh yes, they could get aircraft down below, yes.
Brian, I understand the first aircraft to land on a ship and take off again was in 1911. I think that was in San Francisco in 1911. The guy landed on it. His life jacket, by the way, was a bicycle tube in a figure 8 round his arms, and he had lunch with the captain and then took off and flew off again.
Yeah.
They built a runway on the actual ship. I'm not sure whether she actually went into service. Probably not. But that was the first known US.
Yeah. I can tell you a bit more about that. It was Eugene Ely was the name of the pilot.
Correct.
The aircraft was swung on board and it took off from the USS Birmingham. Later on, he landed and took off from another ship. I forgot the name of that ship. Yep.
He was killed a month later.
Yes.
Interesting to note in the latest issue of the Aeroplane, a replica of Eli's aeroplane was put on the Nimitz to celebrate, I think, the 100th anniversary. They wanted to take off and land, but Oc Health and Safety wouldn't allow it.
Quite right, quite right.
First landing on a British moving ship was a Lieutenant Dunning. That went pretty well. That's part of the family.
Very good.
Then he took off afterwards and didn't survive.
As was often the case. Okay, thanks for that.